Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how can we understand the use of mental imagery in sports from an ecological perspective? How can perception be direct in imagery if there's no stimulus present? How does this all relate to skilled intentionality? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. On today's episode, I want to revisit a topic I first covered way back in episodes 19A and 20, the use of mental imagery. As most people I think know, there's a lot of research demonstrating the benefits of imagery on performance, and several famous athletes have commented that it's been critical to their success. The classic example people use is the quote from Jack Nicklaus. "I never hit a shot, not even in practice, without having a very sharp, in-focus picture of it in my head," Nicklaus said. "First, I see the ball where I want it to finish, nice and white sitting up high on the bright green grass. Then the scene quickly changes, and I see the ball going there, its path, trajectory, and shape, even its behavior on landing. Then there's sort of a fade out, and the next scene shows me making the kind of swing that will turn the previous images into reality." End quote. Like anticipation discussed in my last episode, imagery presents another quote-unquote representation-hungry problem for the ecological account of perception action. Specifically, it's traditionally thought of as an act of mentally simulating an action by manipulating an internal representation. On the surface, this is a challenge for the direct perception approach because there's no currently available information from the environment when we're performing imagery. Well, at least it seems like there isn't. How might we understand this important ability using concepts like affordances and skilled intentionality instead of mental representations? In an article published in 2018, Kiverstein and Reitfeld consider this issue in detail. They start by laying out the challenge. Quote, "Cognitive processes such as imagination, memory, and abstract thought might intuitively strike one as being representation hungry. It seems just obvious that the only way these processes could possibly work is through the mediation of internal representational states. It is natural to think that whenever I think about an object or property X that is absent, counterfactual, or abstract, I can do so only by occupying a state that has the function of standing in for X. How else could I entertain thoughts about that thing if not by means of having an internal state that functions as a stand-in for that thing? Representation-hungry cognition is standardly thought of as a matter of inferential reasoning taking place inside of the heads of individuals. Such inferential reasoning is detached and decoupled from the world insofar as it's carried out on states that function as surrogates for distal, abstract, or counterfactual states of affairs. What is distinctive about higher cognition is its temporal reach. The abilities that are characteristic of higher cognition allow the agent to engage with possibilities that are increasingly remote in space and time." End quote. That last point is particularly important. What seems to be problematic for an ecological account is that direct perception is restricted to the present, whereas imagery is seemingly accessing things from the past so that we can act in the future. Just like we saw with anticipation in my last episode, this idea that direct perception is locked in the present is incorrect, and is actually something that Gibson wrote about himself. Quote, "A perceptual system that has become sensitized to certain invariants, information, and can extract them from the stimulus flux, can also operate without the constraint of the stimulus flux, end quote. What he is saying here is that direct perception is not just about picking up currently available information and acting on it in the present. It's about establishing a relationship with one's environment. And this relationship, this skillful coordination with a landscape of affordances in the environment, has both a past and a future. To explain this in more detail, the authors bring in the concept of enactive cognition. This is the basic idea that the world we experience is created or enacted through our actions. So cognition is not based on a passive perception of a world that exists independently of us, but rather it arises through a dynamic interaction between us and our environment in a process of self-organization. This enactive cognition is situated within a landscape of affordances. Quote, a working day, for instance, consists of multiple interrelated activities, each exhibiting its own nested structure integrated to form a meaningful whole. Each activity depends for its self-maintenance on the mutually enabling interrelations it forms with other activities. Environmental structures are also a part of what gets sustained over time. One's working day consists of well-worn grooves in part because of the behavioral settings in which we do our work, end quote. As discussed back in episode 335 on skilled intentionality, these interrelated activities can be conceptualized as a landscape of affordances, possibilities for action. And being skilled is maintaining an optimal grip on the relevant affordances for one's goals, nesting them appropriately, keeping multiple affordances available, and acting to achieve the optimal one at the right time. Critically, for the issue of mental imagery, affordances have a past. The opportunities for action invited by our environment are shaped by the socio-cultural environmental constraints from our form of life. For an interesting example of this as it relates to coordination in Brazilian soccer, check out the paper I recently reviewed on YouTube. Link in the show notes. Having an optimal grip on multiple affordances also means that behavior is oriented towards the future. Affordances are opportunities to act in the future. They are essentially virtual conditions that might occur. Also capturing this idea is the concept of action readiness in the skilled intentionality framework. Being ready is about acting sometime in the future. Therefore, in direct perception, we are not bound to the here and now because we are always selectively open to multiple possibilities simultaneously at multiple timescales. To quote the authors, organisms in general we have seen act in the here and now, but with reference to a spread out environment, an environment that is both extensive and enduring. Based on their history of taking part in practices, they are able to selectively engage with relevant affordances over longer temporal scales, projecting their sensitivity to the possibilities the environment offers further and further into the future, end quote. While I'm taking the invitation to play soccer with my kids in the park today, I'm also keeping a grip on the affordance that we have to be home by 5 for dinner. Getting home on time is a virtual condition. It is real, but not yet actualized. Finally, another concept the authors bring to play here is sense-making. This is essentially establishing the relevance of the various affordances in our environment. Quote, sense-making is thus best understood in relational terms as arising in the agent's coupling with relevant affordances in its environment. Some affordances have positive valence, drawing the agent into action. Others have a negative valence, repelling the agent away from them. Affordances have a positive or negative valence due to the organism's sense-making capacities. Sense-making, as we understand this notion, should be understood in relation to the agent's skills and abilities that make them ready to respond with varying degrees of urgency to multiple relevant affordances. End quote. So in other words, because I perceive affordances relative to my action capabilities, they have direct relevance or value related to my goals. Okay, let's bring this all back to the topic of mental imagery. As I mentioned before, the reason it is considered to be a representation-hungry problem is that when Jack Nicklaus is imagining the next shot he's going to make, he seems to be completely decoupled from his environment. But if we take the view from skilled intentionality, it does not have to be this way. Through extensive practice and experience, Nicklaus has established a skillful relationship with his environment. He has educated his attention to specifying information, established effective control laws for making good shots, and developed skilled intentionality to maintain an optimal grip on multiple affordances. In this skilled intentionality framework, imagery is simply an extension of this relationship. It is maintaining a state of action readiness to enact affordances, a coordination with one's environment even when the information establishing that coordination is not present. To quote the authors, "We should not think of this process of coordination in terms of decoupled reasoning, because the process of coordination is not instantiated independently from what is happening in the environment. Each of the interrelated activities is coupled to the environment, insofar as it takes the form of an affordance-related state of action readiness. The agent is continuously, through this whole temporally extended process, preparing to take actions that it anticipates will improve its grip on the temporally unfolding situation." End quote. This can also be related to the Gibson quote I mentioned earlier. Essentially, he was proposing that once a perceptual system becomes attuned to the information from the environment, this skillful attunement can be used in the absence of the information. To quote the authors, "In sense perception, a perceiver maintains coordination to affordances by continually tending towards an optimal grip, thereby reducing the disattunement between internal and external dynamics." End quote. What we imagine when engaged in mental imagery is dependent both on our abilities and the affordances offered by the environment, and therefore they're still coupled. In this sense, it does not require representations of the external environment. Finally, the authors sum this all up nicely. Quote, "We dispute, however, that it is necessary to invoke an internal model of affordances that the subject somehow manipulates to understand how a subject could pretend to coordinate to affordances that are absent. Models carry information about what they represent based on systematic patterns of covariation that hold between the model and whatever it is modeling in the world. Instead of locating such systematic structure-preserving patterns of covariation in the head, we suggest looking for them instead in the relations of covariation that hold between the patterns of action readiness and the affordances available in the landscape. What the subject does during mental imagery is pretend to enact the states of action readiness that would typically enable them to coordinate to affordances. This is something the agent can do based on their being attuned to the external dynamics that agents typically use to sustain coordination to affordances. Imagery is thus a possibility for action available to the individual because of their skills for coordinating to affordances, attuning to the structure in the environment. One of the things the agent can do with their skills is to reenact what one would perceive when we're actively coordinating to affordances present in the environment. Performing this reenactment does not require the manipulation of any internal models." End quote. Also, as an addition, in a paper published by 2002, Boschker and colleagues present a very similar take on mental imagery. They conceptualize it as an activity of imagining the action possibilities, affordances, that a particular environment offers. They again note that this was an issue Gibson thought about. Quote, "Gibson speaks of visual imagery as an extension of perceptual knowledge, which is not so continuously connected with seeing here and now as perceiving is." So to sum up today's episode, I imagine, pun intended, for many people, this alternative account of mental imagery is not all that satisfying. Much as we saw with anticipation, the ecological account is really arguing that mental imagery is not really anything special. It's part and parcel with just perceiving and acting. Having skilled intentionality involves maintaining a grip on a set of affordances, which shape how you will act in the future, without always having current information present. It does not have to be some complex mental process we engage in involving the use of internal representations, but just arises from a skillful coordination we've developed with our environment. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.